Thanks for coming, everybody. Welcome to my pixel art tutorial. My name is Quinn Stevens, and you all know me already, but maybe people watching the recording don't. So I have been doing pixel art for a long time, and I'll show you some examples of it really quick. Sometimes I do animations kind of along this line. Sometimes I just do, simple stuff like this. I tend to favor a lot of the same subjects I do in most of my art, which is like a lot of fantasy stuff, a lot of landscapes, a lot of fantastical creatures and stuff like that. So that's only one of the many things you can do with pixel art, though. I mean, it's not necessarily great for every application, but I think it's an incredibly versatile and really fun medium, and I'm happy to share with you some techniques. Someone about to ask a question? I heard an intake of breath. No, okay, sorry, not to put anyone on the spot, but I'm happy to answer any questions throughout this. This is kind of sort of an interactive workshop. Feel free to follow along with me as I go if you want, or you could do your own art on the side, or you can simply just watch. But I'm hoping this will be useful to people who are maybe new to pixel art or who have tried it a little bit and are interested in learning some specific techniques. Any questions before we get started? Cool.
So, question.
Go ahead.
So you said to use your favorite art program.
Mm-hmm.
How do we make our favorite art program into like pixels?
Yeah, I probably should not have been quite so broad, but because like as I pointed out, Procreate unfortunately is not great for pixel art. It's like possible to make it do it, but you have to do a ton of tweaking. If you are a Photoshop fan or a fan of something like Photoshop, then that could be a pretty good option. And there are a lot of free or very cheap apps that do pixel art. But essentially, you want to be using like your pencil tool or equivalent. You want to be using something that basically fills in one single pixel at a time and doesn't anti-alias at all. You're all familiar with anti-aliasing, I assume? If you're not.
Maybe.
Okay.
Quinn, do you know if Clip Studio does this or no?
I would think so, but that's actually probably a better question for Patrick. He uses Clip Studio, right?
Hey,
Oh no, use
Quinn. You done your thing.
I knew it. Okay, hang on. I gotta like. This is hard to do when it's on an angle. Okay, there we go.
All right.
Better?
Yes.
Okay. Every time I go away, I'm trying to look at your. Maybe I just should.
By the way, I think you can share your screen on your iPad with Discord.
Well, I was thinking about doing that, but I think it might be better for you to see me actually drawing.
Ooh, good point. Never mind.
Yeah, but I was considering that as well. Maybe I could do it. If I was more sophisticated, I would just share both at the same time, but I'm not actually sure how to do that. I think I'd need multiple Discord accounts or something. So anti-aliasing. Really? Oh, sorry. There we go. Better? All right. Thank you. Thanks for. Let me know if it flips again, because it's kind of at a weird. It doesn't quite know what to do. In fact, I can lock it. Let me just lock my display right now. And it locks it in the wrong display. Thanks. Thanks a lot. Sorry, everybody. It would not be a live/recorded workshop unless things went wrong. So glad things are going wrong right at the beginning. Set the tone. Okay. Come on. I know you can do it. Great. Okay. I'm not going to touch it again. So this is, I have Procreate open now just as an example, a counter example. Just want to show you quickly what anti-aliasing means. So if I can make a, I can zoom very, very far in Procreate, right? Like I can draw a straight line like that. If you zoom all the way in though, you'll notice these little, like I chose black as my color, solid black. But see how it filled in all these kind of various gray tones along the edge of that line? That's anti-aliasing. That is an attempt by, digital art programs to smooth out straight line, any kind of angled lines, since they really all do, technically all digital art is going to be pixel art. But these days at higher resolutions, you can't really see the individual pixels. And part of the reason why it doesn't look like it's digital and crunchy, and kind of old-fashioned, like, 80s computer art looked, is because of this technique in particular. It smooths it out, so when you zoom out, it kind of makes a nice, more organic looking line. When you're doing pixel art, you generally want to avoid this. You want to get something, if I zoom in here, and this is the piece basically we're going to be recreating. I just kind of did it to have something to work off of. If I zoom in here, you look at my lines here, you'll see this kind of stair-stepping effect where the individual pixels are very clear. That right there is basically, in addition to the low resolution, is what makes this pixel art, essentially. Every individual pixel is part of the composition rather than, being intended to sort of disappear and, be ignored as you would do with high resolution digital artwork. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that was good. Thank you.
Cool. Yeah, so pixel art is both, what I really like about it is it's both it's a purely digital art in a lot of ways, because you are using the individual displays of a screen in a very deliberate way. But if you go back and look at mosaics and needlepoint, and those are art forms that stretch back thousands of years, a lot of the same techniques for bringing together an image from consistent little units of color, that goes back, a really long way, and you can actually take inspiration from a lot of that stuff. So I like how it's this really interesting mix of the ancient and the purely modern. That to me is more interesting than the fact that pixel art tends to be this kind of nostalgic, tends to have this nostalgic appeal for people of my generation and around my generation, where, this is the kind of art that computers were capable of, and they weren't capable of much more than this in like the 80s and the early 90s. Or even before that. So that's one of the things I think is very cool about it. And it's a really, as we go through, I'm going to try to talk a little bit about the ways that you can really use it to its best abilities. Get the most out of having such a small number of pixels to work with, how you can make your images readable and distinct, and how you can sort of use both sort of your inability to use a lot of, you can at once be extremely precise because you are working at the pixel level, but you also sometimes have to just suggest texture in a really abstract way because you can't get small enough to really explain it. One example would be like the grass here, for example. Like, this does not look like blades of grass when you zoom in on it. Like, this is just little squares. So how do you make it look like grass even when you can't zoom out far enough to really define every individual blade? That's one of the things I'm hoping I can teach you a bit about how I approach that particular problem. But anyway, so we're going to do basically the same scene. It's got pretty much everything I like to put in a piece of art. It's got clouds, mountains, rocks, and dragons. And if you've been following my art for a while, you'll notice those things come up a lot. They're just a really lot of fun to draw. So I'm going to start a new project here. I'm doing a 256 by 256 pixel canvas. That's just the standard, or it's one of the standards in Pixaki. Excuse me. Pixaki is what I like to use the most for pixel art. It's an iPad app, kind of expensive. I think it's like about $20, which is, cheap compared to Photoshop, but it's pretty up there for an iPad app with this kind of niche of a application. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend it unless you are really interested in getting into it. But it is very cool. It has really great animation controls. They did a whole overhaul of their UI, so it looks a lot more like Procreate. It used to be a lot more clunky than this, so it's pretty fun to use. And I find it just very easy. But of course, I'm very used to it at this point. But like I said, one of the great things about pixel art is so many apps can do it. Any app that can do a pencil tool that doesn't anti-alias can essentially do it. And we talk a lot in our art channels about all these different Procreate and Photoshop brushes people like, but what I kind of love about pixel art is that there's just basically no such thing as a brush. There are dither brushes in this, and I'll talk a bit about what dithering is. For the most part, you don't need to worry about brushes at all because a single pixel is basically your brush for the most part. You're going to be using the pencil and the fill tool, the paint bucket tool, most of the time in here, and almost nothing else. So I'm going to start out, I'm going to pick a nice kind of neutral sky color. Oops. I'm gonna do like a pretty deep blue. I think that actually one thing I'm going to change from that initial image that I showed you is I want to make things a little bit more intense and saturated because I feel like I kind of washed things out a little bit. I kind of like that approach because it makes it look a little more like older computer displays, which had far fewer colors, so they tended to be much more blazing, vibrant colors. They didn't have a lot of room for like subtle hues in between. So I'm going to start with that, and then I'm going to create a sort of like not really a gradient. So I want to create a glow along the horizon where that's going to be. This is something you will see if you just look at the horizon at any point. And it's a big part of making your landscapes, I think, look more naturalistic. This actually, like a lot of pixel art apps, doesn't really have a gradient tool though. So you could do a true gradient here, but I find that generally just doing bands of color is enough. And the other thing you can possibly do is called dithering. So I'll show you what dithering looks like in a sec, although we're not going to make use of it here because there's no way I would get through this tutorial if we did. So I'm going to pick my horizon color now. And I'm going to go almost white, like very, very bright. This will be one of the brightest areas of the painting. I'm going to call it a painting a few times, but piece, whatever. I'm also going to make it a warmer color. The horizon does tend to be a bit more towards the cyan greenish area, even a little reddish sometimes, depending on the time of day, compared to like upper in the sky. So, and then Pixaki has rectangle tools. I'm going to go ahead and use those. These are the kind of thing you will also potentially find in pretty much any other paint app. So I could also use lines and use the paint bucket to fill it in, but this is what I find the easiest. So I'm just going to make a rectangle, and I'm going to choose a spot right about here, kind of using the rule of thirds here. So I'm going about 1/3 of the composition is going to be below the horizon line, and about 2/3 is going to be above it. I don't really measure it. I just kind of feel it out, but that's like a good baseline to use. And I'm going to start working my way back to my sky color. I'm going to probably do just like 4 bands here, so it doesn't have to be really, really subtle. And I'm just going to kind of fill them in. And each one of these bands is going to be a little larger than the last one. And as I do it, I'm just kind of nudging it. I remember that the color was around here and around here. I'm just sort of going by memory. It doesn't have to be super exact. I'm just kind of gradually nudging it back towards that direction. And finally, I'm going to take the sky color. I wanted this last band to be pretty close to the sky color, so it looks like a natural bridge back to it. And I'm just going to go for that. Yeah, and that works pretty well. So if I wanted to dither here, I'm going to show you really quick what I would do. If I wanted to make this a smoother transition, I'd zoom way in, and essentially you can do this by hand or you can do it with some automated tools. Definitely Photoshop patterns can make this a lot easier, for example. But dithering is when you basically just do like a sort of checkerboard pattern as a way to sort of do a gradient effect. And the easiest thing to do is I just sort of alternate, squares of this color with squares of this color. And I can do that for a little bit. And then that gives me like a sort of perfect halftone between those colors. And usually what I'll do on the occasions when I've done this, because it's kind of hard to, you could technically do this all by hand if you want. And people actually did have to do this by hand once upon a time in the 80s. I'm sure that was horrible. If I zoom way out, I don't know if you're gonna be able to see this, but it sort of softens that transition here. And if you want to get even fancier with it, you can start varying up that pattern and, skipping. In this case, I'm going to skip. Instead of having, one white, one blue, one white, one blue, here I have 3 blue, 1 white, 3 blue, 1 white. And I can kind of continue it like that. And I have actually done this, and it's not a lot of fun, but it's kind of cool to control it at this base level. And that gives you a smoother transition between the colors instead of just having one midtone. But like I said, I don't have time to actually get to all that in this one tutorial, so we're not going to bother with that right now. but that's dithering. And one of the cool things about Pixaki is it does have dither brushes, so that can make this a little bit easier. If you, I call it matrix dither. So let me see if I can get an example here. Okay, so yeah, so I can also, you can make it so it will stick to that checkerboard pattern, and I can actually change the pattern, and that gives you some more options there. But I generally stay away from that. I find that I like the total control that going pixel by pixel gives me. Okay, so since we're doing a landscape, one of the best pieces of advice I ever heard about landscape painting is that you want to start from the farthest point and kind of work your way forward. And you generally will start with colors and values that are very similar to your horizon, because air has mass, and it has particles in it, and the farther things get away from you, the bluer and kind of more indistinct they look. And if you want to suggest distance, that means that the farther something is away, the closer it's going to be to whatever your horizon color is, essentially. And there's going to be less contrast and less distinction between the lights and the shadows. So I'm going to start off with the clouds. I've created a new layer here. I don't tend to do a ton of different layers, but one of the nice things about pixel art is this is such a small image. I could do about 1 million layers and still have an extremely small file. So you don't really have to worry about performance, which is kind of cool. So I'm going to take this almost pure white color that I have here at the horizon. I'm going to start making some clouds. I'm going to make some very, very small clouds, like so. So they're, whoops. So they're not much bigger than that. And I'm drawing kind of freehand here. I'm not really thinking about pixel by pixel building a cloud here. That's not how I tend to approach this. I tend to just kind of let the pixels fall where they will. And then if I really need something to specifically look very precise, like someone's face, for example, I'll have to go in and kind of think about it pixel by pixel. But natural shapes like clouds, mountains, you don't usually have to be that exact, which is nice. So I'm just going to do a couple really small ones too here. I'm trying to keep these all sort of horizontally lined up as well. I find that if you look at the sky, if you look at clouds that are very far away, they don't tend to. Part of what makes them seem very far away. Whoops. Okay. Pixaki has this really annoying thing. I don't know if you saw that, but I was holding down in one place for too long. It decided I was now using the eyedropper, and it just picked up the color that was behind it. I can't turn that off. I can only yes.
Quinn,
Someone.
It's a little hard for me to tell. Is the color of the clouds the same as the color band right below it? I think I missed that part. Okay, cool.
Yes.
Thanks.
They don't have to be exact. Clouds, yeah, are interesting. As they get farther away from you, realistically, like they tend to get much warmer and kind of more reddish, sometimes more so than the sky. It depends on what time of day it is, though. They can change a lot. So this is not obviously like a super exacting thing we're doing here, but so these are super far away. I'm just going to kind of keep them just that one color. As they get closer, I'm going to start defining the shadows on the clouds to give them more depth. And I might do it on these eventually, but I'm not going to worry about it just yet. So now I'm going to do kind of another layer of clouds. And these clouds are a lot closer than the ones back here. So I'm going to kind of make them look more distinct, less uniform, and I'm going to give them a little bit more of a shape. I'm trying to also now I'm starting to think in terms of perspective. That will get more obvious as they get closer, but like you're looking at clouds from underneath them. And I find that if you try to define like a flat bottom to them, they tend to look more physical and three-dimensional. And that's one of the big challenges in pixel art is, I think, making things look like they have, weight and mass, essentially, which can be kind of tricky otherwise. So I'm just sort of filling in some shapes here. And I try to alternate, a big cloud with a small cloud. When you try to do natural stuff, you want to balance everything out as much as possible. You don't want it to look too uniform. I mean, some people do pixel art and they'll do it really, really uniform on purpose. And I think that's also like a totally legitimate style. I could make these all look like the exact same cloud. Because in an old video game, for example, like they probably would all be the same cloud because you would only have enough memory to handle one cloud image and you would just repeat it over and over again. But we don't actually have that limitation currently, so I'm not going to worry about it. All right, cool. So there we have sort of 2 layers of clouds. I don't know how well you can see how much, I don't know what this is looking like on your screen, because these are pretty similar. There's not a lot of contrast here. I want these to be barely visible, so they look very far away. But that might be hard for you to pick up, so let me know if you're having trouble seeing. Although I don't know what I can do to help you. Okay, now that we're getting a little closer, so what I did in the original image is I kind of had this one big cloud that kind of snaked up from back here. And I like this approach. Something I saw in some old video games, actually. I think it was one of the Monkey Island games. I like clouds that kind of almost follow a bit of a path through the sky. They kind of draw your eye from the background up to the foreground. And there's just something very pleasing about that to me. So now I'm getting pretty close, and I'm going to start trying to... Actually, let me go back. Now that I'm getting closer, though, I'm going to start thinking about my edges. Because I want this cloud to have a nice bright edge that's only 1 pixel thick. This is a real, like, these kind of like highlights on the edges of things are something that make shapes look a lot more distinct in pixel art. I think it's a really something that can be more striking in pixel art than it would be in more like high resolution art. So that means I need to be more careful about where I'm putting my actual strokes here. All right. So this is the lit side. Oh yeah, I didn't really talk about this yet, but I've decided that the sun is over here, and choosing a strong and consistent light source I think is really important. Generally for landscapes, no matter what the medium, that's pretty important. But I think it really helps a lot in pixel art too, because then it's easier to define edges and using shadows and stuff like that to kind of define depth when you don't have a lot of space to do so. So now, this is going to get closer. I want the other side of the cloud, this side which is facing away from the sun, to be a little bit darker than this. So I'm going to start figuring out kind of what my shadow color is. I don't want it to be too dark. I want it to be pretty gray, but still have some color. Still on the light side. We'll see how that looks. Yeah, that's pretty good. Okay, so... All right. Yeah, there we go. I like that shape. I'm going to add a little more to the tail of the cloud here, though, because I think that it needs to feel more like this. So this is what I'm talking about, this kind of winding road effect. I'm going to erase a little bit of it, though, because it's getting too thick here. One nice thing I like, too, is I will intentionally, sometimes with a cloud or a natural shape, erase and not be very perfect about it. So you end up with these little kind of floating little wisps at the end. That actually can be really great for clouds. It can make them look a lot more natural, like that. So now I need to choose my fill color, which I want to be neither this nor this color for this big part of the cloud. I'm going to choose something a little darker than this, but a little lighter than that. Probably like right about there. Now I'm using my fill tool, and one of the great things about a fill tool in pixel art is it will completely fill any space that I put it to. I don't have to worry about that kind of weird effect you get sometimes in Photoshop when you have anti-alias art and you try to fill it and it just fills like a weird blob in the middle with this kind of strange fuzzy edge around it because it doesn't know how to deal with those semi-transparent or semi-colored pixels at the edges. That's not something you need to worry about in pixel art because everything is so precise. Cool. So I'm going to use this as kind of the base color. I'm going to start lightening up this side of the cloud now, the part that's facing the sun. I'm starting to think I actually should make this pure white then if I really want it to be lighter. But it could also be a little bit darker. Clouds are kind of weird and you have a lot of leeway with them. They don't always behave the way you would expect things to behave in light. So even though this is sort of the side of them that's facing the sun the most, it could potentially be a little bit shadowed as well. So I'm going to see if I can get away with that. I'm just going to basically use pure white here. I really want to kind of capture that blazing whiteness. And now I'm doing sort of the typical cloud. I don't know if you can see this at all. It's pretty hard to see, but I'm doing a sort of what you might think of as a sort of standard cloud pattern, which are sort of like, I don't know. I draw clouds all the time, so I'm very used to this. I don't know if everyone else is, but I sort of like draw like these kind of like, these kind of, what would you call them? Like not concentric circles, but conjoined circles or something, with a bunch of little circles in them, like little arches that kind of are like fractally, like you have like one big arch that is made up of lots of little arches. I don't know how else to describe it. I wish I had the language here to do so, but I'm gonna use that. And I'm trying to think, like, this is all kind of puffy, but this part of the cloud I'm going to try to define as being pretty flat, so I get that effect of like having like a kind of flat underside, which is something a lot of clouds do have. Let's see if I can get away with it. All right. Cool. So now I have this. I'm not going to worry too much about putting a lot of detail here because this is not the focal point of the image. So I want to make sure that, you know, it should be interesting and striking, but not like draw focus away from the dragon who's resting at the bottom. I'm adding a few kind of more highlights here. Smaller ones in the back. I can see this is getting a little blown out by the camera. So this, what I'm doing here, you'll notice I'm putting a lot of detail here around this kind of transition point between the lightest part of the cloud and this like darker part of the cloud here. And that's something I do a lot. I do this a lot actually even outside of pixel art, but it's especially important in pixel art that places where there's more transitions are the best places to put a lot of small details, and that I will deliberately keep other areas very flat and clean, which helps kind of suggest that the whole thing has texture without the whole thing becoming so busy that you can't really make out the shape anymore. And I'm switching back to the darker color. This is actually almost a little bit like dithering when you think about it. I kind of have this like, I had a dark transition between the white and the gray, and I'm kind of doing these smaller shapes on either side of it to suggest a gradual transition between them. Cool, and I think I need one, I'm gonna take my hand away. I noticed that the camera actually adjusts to whether my hand is in frame. Oh. I'm gonna make one darker color here to suggest that shadowy underside of the whole thing. So I'm gonna take the darkest color here, going to go down about there, still keeping it fairly light because this is not meant to be like a dark storm cloud or anything. And just kind of scribbling here. This is something I actually do a lot in pixel art. And I want to fill an area, but I don't want to fill it too uniformly. I can just kind of do that. And that's what I'm talking about. Again, I sort of just let the pixels fall where they will. I'm not being really exact about exactly where they go. Let's try that. All right, that's not bad. Oops. Accidentally using the paintbrush tool instead of the pencil tool is something I do roughly once every 5 minutes when I'm doing this. All right, so now I'm just going to finish this off by lightening up the far side here so I can kind of suggest that the cloud is it's kind of curving back up over here and it's getting more light from its surroundings. All right. I'm also going to just extend the dark area here because I think that that doesn't quite look like it's as solid as I want it to. There we go again. Filling in, I don't know if you can see that. I'm filling in this area. Whoops. It's hard to focus on what the camera's showing and what my eyes are actually seeing, so I hope I'm not getting too distracted here. All right. I'm pretty happy with that. I'm going to tweak this more later, but I think it's good enough for now. I want to move on a little bit. So now I definitely, this is now the only like dark element in the scene, really. So I definitely want to have a few more other clouds in the foreground that are going to look similar enough that it doesn't stand out too much. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to grab my edge color here that I used in the cloud. I'm going to draw some other ones on the side here. I'm deliberately making these clouds more wispy and insubstantial too, because I like to mix up like a big puffy solid cloud like this with like much smaller ones. I find that that looks a lot more like a real atmosphere. I'm going to fill it with the semi-dark color. And then give it a little bit of the highlight as well, but not too much. I like to put kind of darker elements on the corners of the frame. It gives it kind of a vignette effect. I find if you put really bright stuff there, unless it's like all very bright and you're doing that deliberately, it can kind of be distracting. It doesn't draws your eye. Your eye's always going to pretty much go towards like whatever has the most contrast on screen. So try to only put it where you really want it. Nope, I don't like that. Okay. So I'm just filling in some shadows on this guy too, trying to use the same, I'm using all the same colors and values I use here, so these will look of a piece with each other. It won't be too distracting. I think I basically, now looking at this now, I feel like I need one more cloud here and one more cloud here, and then I'm kind of done with the sky for the time being. I don't know how to describe what feels like it belongs and what doesn't. It's kind of just instinctive for me. There's probably a good reason though. I feel like there's like a more refined way you could actually figure out exactly where things are missing. Probably like a golden ratio thing. So here again, a lot of wispy clouds. Just using little dots and flecks here to suggest small bits of cloud. This is where like, so here, this is one of the first cases where I have an actual element on screen that is literally just 1 pixel. You're going to see more of these, of course, but the cool thing about those is they're so contextual. You know, that could be something like it could be a rock or a bright light. In this case, your eye kind of fills it in and imagines these, even though these are all exactly the same, these 3 dots. Your eye is not going to see them as the same once you zoom out. It's going to sort of fill it in and imagine a bunch of little pieces of cloud and vapor that are all slightly different from each other. You're definitely working with your viewer's imagination a lot here. It's one of the things I think is very fun about this. Again, feel free to ask questions if anything comes to you. I'm happy to be interrupted at any point. Cool. All right, I'm going to go back. I'm going to give these clouds in the rear, which I've accidentally drawn over, just a little bit of shadow. I'm only going to use the lighter shadow color here, though. I don't want them to be too dark because then they're going to look like they're closer than they are. I want them to look far away and a bit washed out, but I still want to give them some solidness. So I'm kind of using, I'm just suggesting again that there's, zoom in here. So I'm suggesting again that the light source is kind of up and to the left a bit and just kind of filling in the opposite side with the gray. And I'm going to keep that in mind as I do all of my other elements in here. Whoops, and I just undid something somehow. Okay. This app is not perfect. It does occasionally behave really weirdly, so hopefully it'll behave itself for the rest of this tutorial. Cool. All right, cool. Well, I'm pretty happy with that sky. So I'm going to go ahead and make a new layer. Everyone is still listening to me, right? It's totally silent.
Yeah.
Okay,
You
cool.
are moving a bit fast.
I just realized I could have been disconnected like 10 minutes ago and had no idea. So
I'm basically playing catch up right now. Very fast.
oh yeah, sorry. I know I'm kind of Bob Rossing it here. He cheated too and did a painting ahead of time and was just copying it. So I feel like I'm just following in the footsteps of the greats here. Okay. Cool. So that's our sky. Oh, whoops! I just created I did this on 2 separate layers. Didn't mean to do that. I'm going to go ahead and merge these using the merge down feature. Most apps have some equivalent of this because I like kind of having distinct layers. where I know where everything is. Cool. So now I'm going to start with the landscape. So I'm going to start with the distant mountains. And again, just like with the clouds, I'm going to try to stick pretty closely to this color here. I'm going to use the slightly darker blue color. And I'm going to make it a little darker and a little less saturated. Actually, I take that back. I'm going to make it a little more saturated because I've noticed this is probably not super realistic, but I do think that in stylized art, sometimes making the distant stuff very blue can actually look very pleasing, even if it's not super realistic. I'm also tilting this now because I'm at kind of a weird angle with my phone. So I'm going to do a line of mountains along the horizon here. And since these are very distant, I'm going to keep them pretty uniform and pretty small. I try to give them a little variation where I can. Whoops, even that's like too much. So I'm going to undo that, or undo, erase it. I think there's a lot of, I always feel very tempted to draw like big, towering, spiky mountains, but then they don't look as far away. So you got to kind of save that for some of the closer ones. We're going to do a few layers here. All right, I'm going to go ahead and fill in all of that. Cool. I'm going to do highlights on these probably eventually. Or maybe I'll do it now. Yeah, I'll go ahead and do it now. Okay. Very, very basic highlights. I'm going to do these pure white. This won't actually always be the case. Oops. Again, I had the paint bucket selected. Just want them to look a little brighter than the background, and unfortunately this like band, and unfortunately that is almost pure white, so I kind of have to just use white here to get them to stand out at all. And I'm just doing like a little kind of edge here. I'm not defining full-on mountain shapes. Whoops, I don't know what I just did. Okay. I'm not defining full-on mountain shapes here because I don't want them to look like just flat mountains that are close up. I want them to look like distant, very tall mountains. Cool. All right, so now I'm going to do another layer, and I'm going to do some closer up mountains. And I'm going to take this color that I picked. I'm going to do a little darker and a little bit warmer again. I'm going to kind of drag it towards that green area, but I'm also going to make it a little less saturated because I don't want it to look like green. Still want these to be fairly blue. And now these are closer up. So these, I'm going to have a little more variety here. Try to make sure I don't cover up too much of the nice stuff in the background. Those other mountains. Yeah. Great. So now we got this kind of nice layered effect. These I also want to be pretty bright. So I'm going to do actually that light horizon color. I don't know if you can see, but this, and not the pure white, but the very close to pure white here. I'm going to use that as my highlight color on these mountains. That kind of makes the background mountains look sort of washed out and far away. Even though I think in real life they wouldn't necessarily be brighter. They actually would probably be a little dimmer because they're farther away and there's more atmosphere in the way to block them. But you can get away with that. And now I'm making a little more of an actual shape here. So this is actually totally something Bob Ross did. Like just defining kind of a slope on the side of the mountain. Basically everything that's in the sun here, kind of doing these little shapes. So what I'm doing is I sort of think of mountains as these kind of pyramidal shapes because they are, very triangular. So like, this side here is facing the sun. It's going to be very bright. This side here is facing away. It's going to be, it's only going to be getting the light from the ambient, sky. So you end up with these kind of sharp edges. And I find that that's what really makes things look like mountains is that sharp contrast between one side of a ridge and the other. If you make them look too lumpy, then they just look like big hills. They don't really look like mountains. I'm starting to do like kind of more stuff in the foreground here. Rather than this just being one big line of mountains, I'm letting them kind of come into the foreground a bit here. Oops. I'm still just sort of thinking in terms of like ridges. Like here's a ridge. There's a sharp slope here, and it slopes down the other way. And I just kind of draw along the line. I just sort of let it almost treat the the pen like I'm falling down the edge of that ledge. I'm getting rid of that actually. I'm not doing any shadows here. These are still far away enough that you wouldn't really be seeing anything darker than this one color. You kind of choose like one flat sort of light shadow color and you just stick with it and you only define the highlights. That helps make things look far away. Notice here too, here's a good example how I try to make things look natural but not too busy. There's a big blob of one solid color here, and then as it transitions into this, it starts getting more broken up and noisy. And you want to be very deliberate about kind of where your noisy areas are and where your solid areas are. So like solid, a lot of noise. You really can easily in pixel art get way too noisy across your whole composition, and that makes it really hard to sort of determine what you're looking at as a viewer, and also just where your attention is supposed to be, like what's the most important thing. Cool. All right, so now kind of filling in a few more shapes here. Right, and then I think that's it for that layer of mountains. And now I'm going to do closer up mountains that are not as tall and have trees on them. So this is where I have to transition from a kind of bluish gray to green, and I always find that transition pretty challenging. So I don't even think I managed it super well in that initial image I showed you. I'm going to see if I can do it better this time. So again, I still want to be kind of coming forward. I want to take this color, this is the darkest dark that's behind it, and start from there. I'm going to get a little darker than that. Still going to be pretty blue though. And now I'm going to draw what sort of, imagine that there's some pine trees here. And this is again where I'm using my like sketchy approach, and I'm just letting the pixels fall where they will. I'm not going to sit there and try to draw individual pine trees here. I'm just going to try to feel it out. So I think we have enough room here. Now notice as everything gets closer, the shapes of the hills need to get larger. So I'm only going to have room for maybe like 2.5 hills across the image here. Still want them to be pretty deep. Now I can kind of, so I'm doing here, I don't know if you can see, my hand is kind of moving like this very quickly. That's how I'm getting that little bit of jitteriness. And it doesn't translate to much. There's not a lot of actual, there's only a few parts here where you could actually say like, oh, that's like part of a tree, that's defining a tree. But that's all you need sometimes. Like your brain again will kind of fill in the background. And I want this to be an unbroken line so I can fill the whole thing in, which is why I'm not going through and going like that. I'm not doing like this kind of thing. I can do that later for details. Cool. So I'm gonna go ahead and fill that in. Great. And now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna show the sun hitting these trees from this side. And it's gonna be a lot greener and warmer than I've been doing before. It's gonna be a bit intense, but so I'm moving this way over to the green. Not sure if this is gonna work. I need to like kind of play around with it until I find the right color. Oops. Once again, I have the wrong tool. Yeah, that's pretty good. So now I'm just kind of now I'm sort of doing little dots essentially, little very small lines along the edge here where the sun would be hitting these. Oops. To kind of define that these are in fact trees. This is still the background, so I'm not too worried about making this really detailed. People, know what they're looking at. They know what mountains and hills look like, so they kind of figure it out on their own. And here I'm just using a very, very noisy section to suggest that like all of this is trees. There's like noise all across this, and if you were looking at a photo, there would be way, way, way more noise. But we're just using suggestion here, so I can kind of just let the rest fall into silhouette essentially, and your eye just kind of fills it in. Cool. I'm going to go back. Actually, no, I'm not, because I'm about to start drawing stuff in the foreground. I was saying this little blank spot here bothers me, but it's probably going to get covered up by the foreground anyway. You'll notice I haven't even drawn where the foreground is. I don't tend to think that far ahead, but I probably should, because then I could waste less time doing these backgrounds. So, all right. So now I'm going to do that little kind of hill. It's right in the front here. I think I actually will start with this same green color here. I'm going to make it darker. Yeah, same hue though. The highlights I will make more yellowish, but I'm going to stick with that. And I'm going to draw the hill where the dragon's hanging out. Currently, I'm drawing like kind of the mid tone of the hill, so you'll notice it's pretty hard. It's kind of hard to see against the background, but that's okay. Cool. I'll just fill in the whole thing like that. And now I'm going to do the shadows next. And these are much darker than the shadows in the background. That's going to make this look really close up and everything else look very distant. I'm going to kind of just, nope, I'm going to accidentally fill in the whole thing. Okay. So I'm just choosing the shadowy side here. And even though this is a hill and it'd be kind of rounded in real life, I sort of choose these more sharp angles for pixel art purposes because it just makes the shapes look much more distinct. Rounding things is just really, really hard in pixel art, so I kind of don't bother with it. And I'm just kind of going over it, and I'm not putting a shadow on every last bit of this, as you can see. Because of the way the light would be falling on it, it wouldn't be like totally in shadow. I'm going to find some here as well. I'm just going to kind of scribble a bit. I try to scribble again so that I still get that mix of like very, very filled in, consistent, solid color mixed in, and then some noisy areas kind of within, as much as I can. I want some dark shadows here on this side too. I don't want it to be all light. And now I'm going to go ahead and do the highlight colors here and make this much yellower. Generally, distant stuff is going to be very cool, very kind of bluish, and close-up stuff is going to be a lot more red and red or yellow and warm. Although that can depend a lot on sort of the lighting conditions. If it's near sunset, it could be like the exact opposite, for example. But for this, it's kind of like a midday shot here. That's generally the rule you're going to follow. Try to get that all along here. Okay. Probably a little too bright, but I don't know. I'm going to see what it looks like once the rock is in place. Make sure that some of that's also over here, so it's not just all in one area. Yeah, it's a little too high contrast, but I think rather than getting rid of this, it actually looks much higher contrast in front of me than it probably does on your screen, but you'll see the final version later. I'm going to choose like a mid-tone in between these, like something light. Actually, wait, no. I want it to be as warm as this, but darker. And we're going to kind of do a bit more of a border here. This is going to also make things look a little more rounded. And more of that color over here. Okay. Cool. So now I've got this hilltop lit by the sun from over there, and I'm going to draw that big rock. I'm creating new layers kind of everywhere here, so you can see. But you don't really have to. But it'll definitely make things easier because since I'm such a big fan of the fill tool, it is kind of handy to be able to use that. So I need. I'm going to use pure white here for the corner of the rock that is facing the sun, because I want it to stand out. I don't know if literally it would actually be that bright from this angle, but I'm not too worried about realism. I'm just trying to make it very intense. Because again, that contrast is really key. One thing I've always tried to do with rocks and natural formations is make them very angular rather than very rounded. I find that makes them look a lot more interesting. try to think of them again in sort of pyramidal and triangular formations rather than just being kind of lumps. All right, so I've done this side. So this is the side of the rock that's facing the sun. This side's going to be facing the sky. So it's actually going to be kind of blue. And I'm going to take the blue of the sky, make a darker, duller version of that as my basis. You want to try to suggest that some of that skylight is being reflected on it. And now this part of this is going to be facing down. This is not going to really get as much of the sky reflection because it's not facing up towards the sky. So I'm going to make that darker and duller. And this is the like very shadowed part, and the dragon or whatever this creature is going to be hanging out there. I try to avoid using like pure black too. This is something you actually might hear a lot of painters say, but I think it's true in pixel art too, because then it starts to look like you're doing like a diagram. It doesn't look as naturalistic. And you want to save the black for when you really need it. Like I might end up using it to define the dragon's shape. So I'm kind of thinking of this as a pyramid in a sense. This is going to be very flat. This is like a flattened edge of what would otherwise be like a triangular pyramid. So there's going to be like a triangle kind of slope here, flat here, and then a sort of maybe a slightly more lumpy, busy area here just to make it look more natural. But I'm kind of feeling this out as I go. So, oops. Let me take this. I'm taking the color I'm using for the shadow. This should actually probably be darker. Doing it a little too much, so I can use my fill tool, and it nicely fills that in. Let me go ahead and actually just make that flat edge. And I'm going to make this a little bit lighter because it is going to reflect some of the light that's bouncing off the grass here. So I don't want to make it too dark. For those kind of naturalistic effects, you can only get away with so many of them when you're doing pixel art, really. So it's okay if you're more simple. So now I'm going to do still a dark color, but lighter. Define this edge here. I'm going to fill everything in there. Okay, so now take that dark color here, actually. Nope. Start defining some kind of little kind of crevices, areas along the rock. And I try to think it always in terms of like the rock kind of splitting apart and becoming kind of, like I said, pyramidal. Various places. One thing you can sort of think of is imagine like water running down the rock, because that's actually what happened. Like if you look at rocks and mountains, they are like slow motion waterfalls because they're showing you where the water has been running down them and weathering them away over, thousands and thousands of years, which is pretty cool. So that's one way you can kind of figure out how you can to make your strokes make sense. So again, I'm trying to make sure I have big flat areas of solid color a lot. Here, overshot. Nope. Trying to get that white back. Okay. All right. So now I said I would make this. This is actually something I'm trying to avoid here. You notice this looks very outlined, almost like kind of coloring bookish. That's something I generally try not to do too much of when I'm doing natural stuff. Cool. So we're hitting about the hour mark here. I actually would not mind taking a quick break if everyone doesn't mind. How's everyone feeling? I think we said this would only last an hour, so I know if you have other stuff going on tonight, you might not get to see the dragon, but I think I'm okay with extending this a little bit past the original deadline if that's cool with everybody else. How's everyone feeling? Total silence.
It should work for me.
Cool. Okay. How's everyone feel about a quick break?
We were muted. We said need.
Okay.
Break is good.
Cool. All right, let's take a quick break.
Yeah.